All right, good afternoon. And for some of you, welcome back. And for others of you, welcome. My name is Paige Durham, and I am the VCCS accessibility provider. I am a contractor, so this is my contract position. And so this afternoon, we're going to talk about Word document remediation. We're going to do some demos, some alt text, some tagged PDF the right way. And then I'm going to give you time to actually take a look at a, a document and try it out yourself. All right, so what I want to begin with is kind of a recap. So, accessibility means people with disabilities can use the same content as those without. Um, because the DOJ, which is Department of Justice, um, passed a ruling in 20 of 24 that said all digital materials must be WCAG 2.1 AA compliant under the ADA Title II standards. So ADA is Americans for Disabilities Act. Title II is the money that is received by institutions in order to meet that. And WCAG 2.1 is the web accessibility guidance. So the golden rule is if you create it, you are responsible for making it accessible. Now, if you all, because you are work study students, are obviously not the creator of most materials, you are remediating many materials that are already being in use. So your job is to remediate and fix the issues that are found. So, and when you are stuck, which may happen, you simply need to ask for help. So there are three different word environments. So I want to make sure that I'm very clear on them because two of them you should not be using as far as remediation of Word documents. So your desktop Windows version of Word or your Mac version is going to be where you check for accessibility. You don't want to use Office 365 browser version or any other OneDrive. You don't want to open documents from OneDrive and try to correct them there. Those will not work. So you're always going to use the desktop Word application. The second thing is if you do not have that application installed on your computer, you can install it for free as a student with your student email. To find the link for that, the easiest way to do that is, I probably should walk you through this. So hold on one second. Let me, nope, not that one. Hold on one. Hmm. Oh, yeah. Sorry, I was looking at my windows going, wait, I don't know where it is. Let me share my Canvas screen. All right, this is the easiest way to find work to install it if you don't have it. You're going to go to the menu of your college, which is over here on the far left, and click on Help. When the side window pops out, you're going to scroll down until you get to VCCS Resources. When you click on that, you're going to get into Student Resources. And from here, this is where you want to be in order to install the full version of Microsoft Office for free based on your email.vccs.edu account. So that takes care of that. I wanted to make sure that you knew where to find that because otherwise we'll spend time doing that later and I don't want to. All right. So the next thing is how to open. There's a couple places in Word that you can check accessibility. But the easiest way is to go to the review tab and click on check accessibility. And then that's where you're going to go. Now, I did put the instructions for Word for Mac and Word Online. I just want you to know that sometimes those online version, especially the Word Online and the OneDrive, do not actually tag appropriately and will not necessarily find all of the issues. And then the last thing you're going to want to know how to do is to save it as a PDF. Now, when I say that save as PDF, I do not mean save as Adobe PDF, which you will see on my screen when we open a Word document. So just give me 1 second. I need just to find some random document. I apologize. Oh, perfect. All right. So the 6 most common issues you're going to find in any Word document are missing alt text, tables without headers, low color contrast, fake headings, which means somebody used bold or large font to be a heading, but that's not, and vague text, like click here, read more, and a missing document title that is found in the metadata, not actually at the top of the screen. So when you run the accessibility checker, you're going to find that many times the information that's there will show up. Sometimes, however, it won't. And when it doesn't show up, that's when you need to understand what the rules are and fix it according to whatever is in the document. So I'm going to show you a document. Now, this is obviously a uh, syllabus from Virginia Western. Doesn't matter where it's from, it's fake. And I want to run the accessibility checker. So I'm going to go up here to the review tab. And here is in the ribbon, you should see check accessibility. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that. And now I have a panel that pops open on the side. Now you can see that this checked a couple things. Unclear hypertext, no headings, merge split cells, table structure, alt text, hard to read text contrast. And it says that all of the issues are fixed. However, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in here and I'm going to open the navigation pane. Now, when I open the navigation pane, this is your table of contents. This is where your heading structure really matters. So to figure out whether or not we have this done correctly, if I put my cursor in this top line, this should be a heading 1. If it isn't, now I understand you see title there, but title is not what we're doing. We're using headings. Title is irrelevant. So I'm going to go ahead and click on heading 1. Now, the next thing is a course information. Now, this should be, in my opinion, should be a heading 2. So I'm going to go up here and I will find a heading 2. And I'm going to mark that as a heading 2. Now you see how over here it's beginning to build out a little bit different. Now, course description, obviously here is missing completely. And why is it bold? I have no idea. So I'm going to do, before I do anything else, I'm going to actually remove the style so that it matches. And now I'm going to highlight course description and also make this a heading 2. So now you can see as I start adding the headings, that's where it goes. Now required materials can be, that it's just, right now it's a heading 3, but I'm going to go ahead and change that to a heading 2. So now we can see where we are. But textbook, this has been marked as a heading 1. That's not a heading 1. It's not a new section. That's still part of the first section, which is about this information. Now, course outcomes, again, we could leave that as a heading 2. And now notice that when we move into this, now we're getting into heading 3 and so on. Now, if this looks strange to you and you don't like the spaces in between the sections, you can certainly remove those and it doesn't change the structure. So as I'm moving through this, you can see, now let's go back up here to the top because now I want to talk about this table. So as soon as I clicked in the table, you see I had 2 new tabs pop open at the top, and that is table design. So important for table design is that either a header row or the first column has been done. In this case, it's just the first column. So the screen reader would read semester credits 3, lecture hours 3 per week, prerequisites none, transfer status, passport. Now, if there were more columns, then it would read semester credits 3, semester credits 6, semester, whatever it is in those other columns. It would always read that key before it read the number. Now, table layout is where you can find properties. So if I click on properties, you can go to alt text. And now this is where you would put in a title. Your tables should have titles. This title for this table is course information. And then I could put a description in here, but that's not as important as the title. So that's where you would put in the title or caption, depends on what you're calling it. Captioning the table is the same thing as titling the table. And that again is found under table layout and properties. Now, I want to be very clear that this is for Word, not for anything else, not PowerPoint, not Excel. The tools all work differently whatever tool you're using. So we're just talking about Word right now. Now, for color contrast, what I can do is I can go back to review. I can click on again, you have the options here. Notice that you have check accessibility, alt text, focus, navigation pane. Navigation pane is the table of contents that you see here on the left. Now, so while you are looking at this, one of the things that obviously the color contrast is okay, so we're fine. But if it weren't fine, you would see something over here in this hard to read text contrast. Now, while we're also here, I do want to take a minute and show you a few more things. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Options Accessibility. Now you can see I have another window that has popped open, and you have some options here to turn on or off. So I'm going to let you look at that for just a second while I take a break. So you can enable the option to generate alt text using AI. That's perfectly okay. Expand all the headings when opening a document. That's okay. Use reading order for any arrow key navigation. I would highly suggest that you also turn that on. The only thing I don't have on is provide feedback with sound. That's just because it irritates me. But you should probably go in and turn those things on. And the reason being, this at the very bottom of my screen, I'm not sure you can see it, You see accessibility good to go. That runs all of the time. So every time I open my Word document, that bar is there and it tells me whether or not I have a problem. So I'm gonna you're gonna want to fix the things that you can find quickly in the document. So I want to go back and talk about this for a minute. All right, now, so now for Word on a Mac, it's the same location, same panel, but instead of using, you're going to use Command for shortcuts instead of Control. So that's your only difference. All right, so now we can look at this. We can see that this. So when you are looking at headings, and I'm going to give me 1 second. Sorry, my computer is not cooperating. I'm just lost. All right, so I'm going to open a document, another one. And I'm just going to let you take a look at this. So what you should see already is that there is this new icon over here on the left. And it's telling me that I need to review some things because there are now, but if you look at the bottom, it says good to go. So which one do you go with? You obviously go with when you see it in the document that there is a problem. So we're looking at this and you can see that there are a few things that are wrong with this. And I'm going to give you this document to play around with. Now, what I do want to talk about though is structure. Again, I want to reiterate in case you weren't in the session this morning, that there should only be one heading 1. If there is more than one heading 1 in a document, that's not a deal breaker. It's just not a best practice. So keep that in mind. Now, the next thing you want to notice is that you don't ever want to skip levels. So a heading 1, the next thing should be a heading 2, and then a heading 3. Now, if you need to go back up a level, you can always do that. You can go back to a heading 2. You just can't go from a heading 1 to a heading 3 in that order, but you can go back to another heading if you need to. So, and you don't ever want, now, some people also don't like a font size or color or whatever, and they want it different. And that's okay. But the thing is, you can change the headings and style like font without actually untagging it as a heading. So let me show you what I mean by that. Because you may hear this I'm going to use this one. So if I go to this and I highlight this, and I don't want it with this font, I want something else. I'm just going to pick Poppins, right? But then I change it to a heading 1. And again, now it changes it again. So now I can change it back. But notice when I change it back, it still stayed as a heading 1. That's the key. So you can change the font once it's been tagged as a heading. So don't let, if somebody says that's not what I want, then you can fix that. But know that it has to be tagged first before you can change the font style or size. So, all right. Now, alt text. So without alt text, a screen reader literally just reads image, nothing else, or image.png. And that's a problem because that's not very helpful. So you want to describe the image, what it communicates, not what it looks like. So if you don't know how to get to the alt text, you can right click on it and then you're going to be able to view the alt text. You want to write a short description or you want to mark it as decorative. Now, I want to go to and pull up. I literally have 1,000 tabs open today. Oof. Um, all right. I'm going to go to Gemini and I'm going to add and upload a file. And I'm going to say, I need alt text. This image, a just assume that you knew that's what that image, that picture was in a document about meeting deadlines. Less than 150 characters. And that's all I'm going to type. Nothing else. Now, I could have just taken a screenshot. All right, so now you can see, and I'll make this picture bigger so you can see it. Again, Darth Vader and a little boy with laptops, right? But remember, I told you this had to do with meeting deadlines. So the alt text reads, Darth Vader and young boy sit at a desk with glowing laptops, reviewing data charts to meet a deadline. That's the key, is that it talks here about, so then you would just copy this information and put that in for the alt text. Again, super fast, copy, paste, done. So you can rerun the accessibility checker, of course, after you've done these things to make sure that they meet. Now, I'm not talking about Google Docs today, so I'm only talking about Word, but Word, it's the same thing. You're going to right click and add the alt, not Word, Google Docs, you're going to add the alt text the same way. All right, so now let's talk about a table. Nope. Well, yep, maybe. All right, so tables. You can click anywhere in the table, which is what I told you, and then you're going to have two tabs that open at the top of the word ribbon. Table design and table layout. Table design is where you're going to be able to decide whether it is a header column or header row or both, and then you can uncheck the box so that the screen reader knows which one it is. Then you're going to tab over to table layout, click on properties, and that's where you would add a title. The other thing when you're looking at tables, you're probably also going to encounter times when it says merged cells are problematic. So you may need to go to your friendly AI companion and you may need to ask a couple questions like, I have merged cells. What's the best way to deal with this for WCAG 2.1 AA compliance? And that is important to know. You add that in your prompts for generative AI and Gemini and Copilot. So if you do have that happen, that's going to be one thing. If you also have split cells or things like that, this is very confusing to a screen reader and it's extremely difficult to maneuver. So you're going to try to avoid. Empty cells are fine. Empty cells may come up as a warning, but they're okay. Some people like to use empty cells because they're using it as a table that gets filled in, and that's okay. But merged cells are a problem. Link text. This is really easy, right? So if it is to a web page, then the link descriptive text is going to be wherever the page is, wherever you're taking them. That's the name. Now, you can also add information such as opens in a new page or PDF and the size of the PDF whatever it is, so that somebody knows that they're downloading something and how big it is. So anything that says click here, read more, this link, or it is what's called a raw URL is not compliant. So again, to edit a hyperlink in a Word document, you right click and then you can edit the link. So just kind of keep that in mind when you're kind of fixing things. So now this is the part that gets most people really, truly tripped up. So within the properties of the Word document, there is a title area. So let me go back to Word. And this is the thing most people don't even know exists. You're going to click on File and then Info. That's the piece most people miss. It's this box right over here that says Title. And that is the metadata that has to be completed in order for it to pass accessibility. Now, you may rarely will you ever see that completed. You will most of the time see it empty. But before you do anything else with this document, you have to make sure that there is a title in that box. Most of the time, it's the title that's on the page, but Microsoft is not smart enough to put it in that box for you. All right. So now while we're here, I want to show you a few other things. Now you can add the author and all of that other information if you want to, but it doesn't really matter. That's for that. So while we're here, I do want to talk about this save as Adobe PDF. Do not use that if you are saving this from a Word document that you've corrected into a PDF. If you do, you have now have an inaccessible PDF that has removed all of the hard work that you just did to tag this with the tables and the alt text and everything, and now it has all been stripped. There is a way to save it that will keep all that, but we'll get to that in a minute. So now I want to briefly talk about color contrast. Earlier this morning, I gave you all a link to something called WebAIM Color Contrast Checker. I'll give it to you again in case you weren't here. There is your color contrast checker. So with that color contrast checker, you're going to be able to pick colors and test out the ratio. The ratio that is important, if you notice, it tells you right here, 4.5 to 1 for regular text. Regular text is size 11 font. For large text, that's 18 or larger, or 14 bold, is 3 to 1. So, and again, I put this link, it's also here. And pretty safe things that you can always kind of count on are black background, white text, or flip it. White background, black text, right? Dark gray on white, pretty much works. But there are some times when you will need to change the contrast because it will not meet because somebody has done something like light gray on white. And again, let's play around with it for just a minute with the contrast checker. So if I go to the contrast checker, and you can see this is easy enough. I have installed on my Chrome something called a color picker. That's up as an extension in Chrome. So I can pick any color from the web, and then it's going to tell me the hex code up here in the top. Easy enough, right? So I'm going to pick this color right here, whatever that is. No idea. And then if I click on it, I can put this here and enter. And now you see it fails. And you can also see why it fails. So I have a couple choices. So if I really am just in love with that light blue, now I can go over here to the background and I can test out to see if I can make it pass, and I can. Now, you still see a fail here. But what you see is this is AAA compliant. You do not need to meet AAA compliance. You only need to be AA compliant. So this is a light gray. I could actually move it up just a smidgen. Right about there is as good as it's going to get. Now, that to me is not great. I don't like that at all. This to me is much easier to read. So that is an idea of how kind of to play around. Now let's go back here. And now we're going to say we're back to white, but we want to keep a shade of blue. But now we got to figure out what shade of blue is going to pass. So we're going to move the little slider until we get to that. And now we are good to go. So now you see we have a little bit darker blue, but it's easier, much easier to read. Now, of course, the darker you make it, the more it passes. So that is your color contrast checker. So let's go back to talk about the last piece of information here. So you are never, ever going to use print to PDF or file, print, save as PDF like Adobe. That's not going to work. And you will always use save as, and then we have a few more steps. So I'm going to go back to Word. And now we're going to talk about this piece. All right, so we're still on this title, this info, but now I want to go to how to save this. So what I'm going to choose is save as. Now, I always do this. This is how I choose to do it. Again, you cannot do this in OneDrive. Please do not try. It must be on your desktop in order for this to work or do anything correctly. So you're going to click Browse. Now, when this opens, now you have a couple things that you're going to want to check. The first thing you're going to do is change the type to PDF. So now we have changed it to the PDF. Also notice right here is another box where that title is missing. That's another place that you could add the title. Could. It's better to go ahead and save it in the info box than here. But if you've missed it and you see it here, then you need to add it. The next thing you're going to do is click on Options. Now, when you click on Options, you're going to want to make sure that you have two boxes checked: document properties and document structure tags for accessibility. Do not check this PDFA compliant. That is a hot mess of horrible, and I don't want to go into that today, but just don't do that. So what you do need, though, is you do need to check this box and make sure that is checked. You do not need to do this every single time. Once you've done it on your personal computer in your Word app, in your desktop app, you shouldn't have to check that box again. It should stay checked. If you aren't sure, it's always better to check rather than not. So that's what you want to do. So then when you click OK, then you could save it. And now you have a compliant PDF. But again, you have to go through all of those steps in order to get to that point. So here's your little workflow. So you're going to open a Word document. You're going to run the checker. You're going to fix the errors, fix the headings, fix the tables, add the alt text, check the links, check the color contrast, and that is going to get you to a compliant document. So now let's talk about the flip side of things. So let's say you have a PDF that is a picture. Somebody used a Xerox machine or somebody used print to PDF. Whatever they did is not compliant. So you can, if you have Adobe Acrobat Pro, open it, have it, the text scanned, and all of that. Now, you can also upload it to Word Online and do that. But I'm actually going to show you a way to do it inside of Gemini when I get to the right window. So now you're going to click and add the file. have no idea what this is. We're gonna open it. I'm sure it's not. All right. Oh, so it's my resume. Ah, who knew? Anyway, works for me. So now what I did, and I can give you this, I'll put this in the chat. Well, I was going to put it in the chat. Here we go. So that's the prompt I used. Nothing spectacular about that by any means, right? So now you can see that it tells me copy and paste. And then I'm still going to have to format this. But what I don't have to do is retype the whole thing. Nobody has time for that mess, right? Okay, you do have to check it to make sure that the AI pulled out all of the information. And then it also gives you what you should set. So it says my name should be a heading 1, the summary core companies, blah, blah, heading 2, built-in list, color contrast, alt text, reading order, run the accessibility checker, and then properly export. Way faster than typing that mess. Now, you could also do it in Copilot, but I'm not going to tell you that Copilot will give you everything like Gemini gives you. So you can do that. Now, that's the easiest way to do it. And I would highly suggest that if that is that you are remediating a document, that you use artificial intelligence to help you convert that. All right, so I'm going to give you a link to a document for you to play with. And what you're going to have to do is when you get this link, it is in Google, but I need you to download it as a Word document in order to work on it and not work on it in Google. All right, so I'm going to give you this copy link. You should be able to get to that. Then again, you're going to go to File, and you're going to go to download, and you're going to download it as a Microsoft Word document and then open that on your computer. And then I'm going to stop sharing, and I want you to walk through while we're here together for the next 5 minutes and see what you can fix and any questions that you have when you open that document and you run the accessibility check. And then we'll talk about it. So I'm going to give you just a few minutes. It shouldn't take you long. So remember that you're not opening it in Google. You are downloading it as a file and then opening it in Word on your computer. And I'm not sharing a screen, so it shouldn't be hogging up your stuff. There are 6 issues in that document. I'll just tell you that. I don't care what Word tells you. I'm telling you. Okay. So hopefully you've had a chance to look at that. And I want to go through, oh no, not one. I want to go through the what you should have found. If you didn't, it's not a big deal, but whatever. First thing you should have noticed is that the section 1 overview was bold and large, but used a normal style. It did not have a heading 1. So you should have applied a heading 1 style. The second thing you should have found is that the image had no alt text. So you could have written a short description, or you could have let artificial intelligence, which is built in, actually do the alt text for you. So if you clicked on generate description, it should have generated. Members trained on accessibility, creation, bars colored blue, green, orange, purple, highlighting, remediation, blah, blah, blah. And then you would click approve, and then that would be fixed, right? So that's your alt text. The table did not have any headers. So the table had a bold row, but it was actually not marked as a header row. So again, you would fix that in the table design tab. And only check the box that said header row. Issue number 4 was the click here link, right? You have to make click here descriptive. It cannot just stay click here. The next issue was low contrast. Now, I don't know what your word, when you checked in accessibility, but my did not actually flag the unclear hyperlink text. And so that's why I told you that it is only about 50-50. So again, that is a problem. So you could use and the last, so that was one issue. And color contrast, the title, the subtitle was in light gray text. Obviously, it was super hard to read. So you would want to make that text a lot darker. And then the last issue was when you got to it, the document, there was no title in the properties. So again, you had to go to info and look in that title box, and there wasn't a title there. And so you needed to do that. So what I'm going to give to you now in the chat is a link to the document that kind of talks about everything that I've just went over. The title of the document itself is a link to the presentation. Actually, I'm not sure it is. Hold on. Yes, it is. Okay. And the rest of that is kind of what I've gone over. At the very bottom, it goes through the reference file and about with the document. So, and it also has my personal email address. So does anyone have any questions or comments on anything in Word? Please also know that everything that I've talked about is found on the website. I will give that to you again. Let's go here. I wanted to also show you one more thing. Here we go. All right. Inside of my website, under tools, you see AI for accessibility, but you also see this Google Drive resource library. If you scroll down through here, you're going to find an entire document on Word and how to make Word documents accessible. And again, it is a very lengthy document. So if you are questioning and you need to remember something, you can always come here and find that. So does anyone else have any other questions on Word? And then I think the next workshop is converting Word to an accessible PDF. But we're also going to talk about PDFs, saving it the right way. So We kind of did sort of that today, but we'll talk about that some more. I don't think that was the right session. I think it's supposed to be PowerPoint Canvas. Yeah. So I'm going to probably change that, but that's okay. So the next workshop, whatever it is going to be Monday at 10 o'clock. Anyway, all right. That's it. It's 12:45, 20:46. I don't believe in keeping people long, so I'm going to stop the recording.